James Baldwin said, "History is not the past, it is the present. We carry our history with us. We are our history. If we pretend otherwise, we are literally criminals." How is our local and community history connected with national history? And how can I use my community's history in the classroom? Tune in today and you can hear how. Thank you for being with us, Dr. Donaldson. Dr. Donaldson is a professor at USC since 1999. He's a scholar of Southern history and African American life and culture in the 19th and 20th centuries. He's also the founder of the Center of Civil Rights and History Research at University of South Carolina, as well as Columbia SC63. I want to know if you could tell us a little about yourself outside of the mini biography.
Sure, I'm Bobby Donaldson. I am a native of Augusta, Georgia. I grew up in a public housing project in Augusta, went to the public schools of Augusta, and I was part of an experiment in education. We had a magnet school in Augusta that was called the Davidson Performing Arts School. And so students who go there have to declare a major. And when I went, I was playing violin in 5th grade. And I realized that by 6th grade, violin was not cool. And so I declared a new major. And the new major was theater and drama. And so I majored in theater at Davidson. And then after high school, I went to a small liberal arts college in Connecticut called Wesleyan University. And there I majored in history and African American studies. And since that time, over 30 years ago, that's what I've been doing for a profession.
Wow, I think it's pretty clear. Would you say that experience really impacted what drove you to want to go into academia and be an educator?
Well, somewhat. I knew growing up there were kind of 3 things that I had in mind as a young boy in Augusta. And remember, I'm living in what we now call public housing, but for me it was just our neighborhood. And I was described at that time as a boy preacher. People thought I would be a preacher. I thought I might be a teacher or a lawyer. And when I went to Wesleyan, I majored in political science initially, and with a thought that I would go off to law school. And in my sophomore year, there was a professor named Michael Harris who saw my interest in history, and Professor Harris said that he would sign me up for a fellowship. And it was a group called the Andrew Mellon Foundation. And the Mellon Foundation's goal was to diversify the academy. At that time, I had no idea what the academy meant or who it constituted. But what I did know was the fellowship would pay me twice as much as my work-study job. And guess what my work-study job was? My work-study job at Wesleyan was to take books that came in, to insert a metal strip so that when you went through the alarm system, it would go off. And I also ironed on all of the Dewey Decimal System locations on the bookmark. And so that was my job. So Professor Harris told me that I could make twice as much money doing research and helping him. And it was that mentoring, that tutelage that led me to becoming a professor.
Wow. I'm assuming you enjoyed doing research more than you did putting metal strips in the books as well.
Absolutely.
I can imagine. Well, that's amazing. And I think we've all benefited from you not going to law school and kind of going to research. I know there's a desire or a drive for a lot of history majors to go to law school because they think that's the next step.
Right.
But I think, just personally speaking, I know you've done amazing work. So we've all benefited from you being a historian.
Thank you.
So what brought you to USC specifically?
So I came to the university in 1999. At that time, when I applied for a position, I was living in Hanover, New Hampshire. I was a Thurgood Marshall dissertation fellow at Dartmouth College. And I had always thought that my next career move would be to a small liberal arts college. And when I went on the job market, I was really going on the job market just to kind of test the waters, because I was not finished writing my dissertation. And so I tested the waters and got 2 job offers on the same day. One was Davidson College in North Carolina, and the other was the University of South Carolina. And this school was not the school I ever aspired to teach in or to take part in, but what was attractive at that moment was the idea that I would, one, be a professor of history and African American studies. Now, remember what my major was in college,
right.
History and African American studies. And also that I could help build on what was happening here and be part of a cluster hire. So they were willing to bring in 3 professors of African American history. And at that time, Davidson had no African Americans in their history department. And so that was a draw, that I would be part of a growing African American Studies program, that I would have a chance to work with some pioneering scholars like Dr. Andrew Billingsley, who was a leading sociologist, who is still a mentor of mine at the age of 95 years old, and Dr. Cleveland Sellers. So Cleveland Sellers was a sort of a legend in the civil rights movement, very active in SNCC, but he was teaching African American history when I joined the faculty. And so he too became and remains a mentor. So that was an attraction. And the other thing, as I thought more about it, was to be at a flagship university that would advance research and teaching. But here at South Carolina, there is an extraordinary, as you know, rich collection of materials, many of which have been buried for decades. And so knowing that I could enhance my teaching and my research with these invaluable primary sources was also very attractive to me.
I can imagine. I know in other conversations, we've spoken about how that's still growing today, right? That's not something that USC acquired and it kind of sits on. It's something that is constantly growing.
Yeah, and we're helping with that, because part of the goal of the Civil Rights Center is to build collections, and that they are not just simply sitting in boxes, but they have utility, and that these collections will be used for course instruction, for professional development of teachers, but also to support research, both undergraduate research and research among graduate and professionals.
Well, speaking of the center, so you lead the center. Could tell us a little about that, what you do there.
So the Center for Civil Rights Research and Research was established in the fall of 2015. It was established several months after the tragedy at Mother Emanuel Church in Charleston. We had been planning to launch it prior to that, but there was a real catalyst once this happened. And the essential goal of the center is to acquire collections, to use those collections for research and teaching purposes, and for public programming. And the real driving force behind the center was Congressman James Clyburn. So Congressman Clyburn started out his professional life as a teacher of social studies and history, and has always had a strong passion about history. And at some point, the university wanted to acquire his collection, all of his letters and photographs and material of that nature, speeches, and he initially said no. And he said no for a couple of reasons. One, he had a strong commitment to his alma mater, South Carolina State. And the other reason he said no was he did not trust the university. So he and I started talking. We built up a strong rapport. We made some compelling, I think, arguments why his collection should be among all the other very strong civil rights collections housed on the campus. And then he said, well, I will be willing to donate my papers if they are a part of a very clear project on campus. And that project became the Civil Rights Center. And so we are still acquiring his papers, and his support has enabled us to expand our staff, to grow our endowment, and to be extremely successful in grant funding. So to date, the center, in collaboration with other units on campus, has generated about $2.2 million in grant support since our founding, which is pretty successful for a small operation like ours.
Right. When you also support teachers, correct?
So some of those grants include grants from places like the National Park Service, the National Endowment for the Humanities, the State Department of Education. And so over the last 5 years, we've probably done 3 or 4 different teacher training institutes or professional development opportunities virtually and on campus. And we've done that in partnership with other units on campus, including the School of Education.
Wow. So when y'all are doing those outreaches and those programs, are you helping provide teachers with primary sources? Are you covering
part of this, and that's why I'm glad we're
just educating them?
Both. Because part of what we realize, because you've been in the trenches, I mean, teachers are overwhelmed by the material. They are overwhelmed by primary sources, overwhelmed by secondary references. And yet, there's very little discussion about how to teach it. How do you make the most use of it, really, in the limited amount of time that most teachers have? So, for example, we spent 3 weeks this summer immersing, and that's probably not the right word, overwhelming teachers in primary sources on Reconstruction. So we talked for 3 weeks about people from Reconstruction, laws from Reconstruction, documents from Reconstruction, documentaries from Reconstruction. And so the teachers have a long list of extraordinary material. But how do they teach it? How do they apply it? And how do they apply it when sometimes you may have, what, a week, 2 or 3 days on the topic? And so we're mindful of that as well. And so part of going forward, what we aspire to be is a real destination for teachers, not only in South Carolina, but around the country, who want kind of effective strategies about teaching topics related to the Black freedom struggle. So from emancipation to Reconstruction to the modern civil rights movement.
Yeah, that's amazing. I can tell you from personally, so I went to high school in South Carolina, and I also taught in South Carolina, and I can tell you Reconstruction is one of the most fascinating eras to talk about, but it's oftentimes overlooked. And some students feel like, oh, not much happened, or it's just the thing that happened in between events, but it's untrue. I mean, even looking at South Carolina, our South Carolina legislator during that period, got a lot done. A lot of people don't know, and of course you know, public education was invented in this time. And those are things that I feel like students could really see, and it would be meaningful to see how it affected their lives.
And there's no excuse at this university for skirting the topic. And I have in this office above my desk a photograph of the normal school, and those are men and women who were trained here to be teachers, who are a byproduct of the advances of Reconstruction. Outside of our library, Thomas Cooper Library, there's a 9-foot statue of a man in bronze. So who is he? Richard T. Greener, the first African-American professor to teach on this campus, the first known black graduate of Harvard College, who joins the faculty in 1873. Every student in this state should know the steps that led to this extraordinary integration of the University of South Carolina, where at one point 90% of the students on this campus were African American. Or you can think about a marker. There's a marker near the corner of Assembly and Blossom Street, right in front of a building called the Strom Thurman Wellness Center. Well, that marker talks about a woman named Celia Dow Saxon, who is a graduate of the normal school on this campus in the 1870s, who spent 50 years teaching history in the public schools of South Carolina. So that's information that's not about Washington, D.C. or New Orleans or Philadelphia. It's about South Carolina. And it seems to me there's both a scholarly obligation and a moral obligation for us to be stewards of this education and this history.
Oh, couldn't agree more. And I think it's so clear when you start talking about it how connected this is with United States history at large, not just South Carolina history or local history, right? But it's a way in which you can teach United States history through these local examples because it's all connected.
Right.
With our
So for example, when our teachers in nearly every standard has this, the Hayes-Tilden Compromise, or the Compromise of 1877. So, well, what does that mean in South Carolina? What does that look like? What it means in South Carolina is that Richard T. Greener is fired from his job. What it means in South Carolina is the students who are enrolled on this campus are expelled, who are dismissed, even though they are only a few hours away from graduating, degree hours. What it means is when those troops leave, which we all talk about, a reign of violence comes down in this state. And the black majority, they are targeted because they dare to exercise their rights as citizens. So, as you said earlier, Reconstruction, there's a lot there, and it's particularly meaningful in a place like South Carolina.
Absolutely. And I couldn't agree more with having a professional and a scholarly obligation to talk about it, because even today, I would say that after that period, it's intentionally left out, right? And today we have an obligation to talk about it because we know that it's been intentionally left out.
Well, you know what's interesting is you cannot appreciate January 6th of 2021 unless you understand Reconstruction. When white vigilantes try to take over the seat of government, that was not new. What we saw on that day were individuals who some knew the history, some did not, who were literally pulling out a script that has been used over and over again so that So when we talk about voter suppression and stolen ballots, that's Reconstruction. I mean, Reconstruction's demise is a direct result of white vigilantes, a direct result of stolen elections. And so to make sense of what happened only a few months ago, you have to be deeply connected to the history.
Absolutely. I can't remember who, but I heard someone say once that, well, history doesn't necessarily repeat, it rhymes. And I think that's kind of what you're speaking to, the very similar tactics. Not exactly the same, but very, very similar.
Mm-hmm.
And if you understand Reconstruction, then you really can actually understand what's even going on today.
That's why a book that I use is called Black Reconstruction. It's written by the great scholar Dr. W.E.B. Du Bois. And in the last chapter of that book is called The Propaganda of History. It is a reminder that history, as much as we are trained for it to be objective, it is not. It is extremely subjective. And he chronicles the degrees to which Reconstruction is a part of this subjective inquiry about the past. And so as we think now about what do you include in standards, what sources do you privilege, how do you think about hotly debated topics like critical race theory? I mean, all of that is folded into a long historical struggle about education. One of the books that I purchased this past year, so I collect rare books, and one of the books I've been eager to get for years and finally found it. It's a book published in the 1930s called The Miseducation of the Negro.
Carter G. Woodson.
By Carter G. Woodson. And again, if you want to understand now the current cultural debates about education and what the intent is, read Woodson. It's very clear what the intent is.
And that book was written in 1933, and it's still very relevant today.
Right.
I couldn't agree more, especially discussing, a lot, especially in social studies at every level, even in elementary school. You're showing students how to understand perspective. But I think it's important that as educators we also think about the perspectives that we hold, kind of like you're saying, because what we privilege, what we don't, and it's important to make sure that we're showing students multiple perspectives, but also not privileging certain perspectives over others.
Correct.
That way students can have an understanding and kind of look at the world in a very sober look.
And it's been eye-opening to me as a professor working with school districts around the state of South Carolina and really around the country, how you have teachers who are all well-meaning, some who are extremely well-trained, but they don't have the first clue as to how to start talking about some of these challenging topics or how to break the mold of things they've been taught about Reconstruction or about the Civil Rights Movement. So in this room, sometimes I'll have students who come to me they do the National History Day events, and they come in to me to talk about as an expert witness, and they come in here all the time to talk about Rosa Parks and Martin Luther King Jr. And then what I remind them of Dr. King's connection to South Carolina, and there were several. I also remind them of the case of a woman named Sarah Mae Fleming, who was a young woman in 1954 who challenged bus segregation in Columbia. And she filed a lawsuit against the owners of the bus company called SCE&G, and her lawsuit was later cited in the lawsuit of a case called Browder v. Gale from Montgomery, Alabama. So Sarah Mae Fleming had a pivotal lawsuit in this country, but she's in no one's textbook. And so part of what we're doing in the work with the center is literally rewriting a history that has been long taught and offering correctives about what transpired and also about the critical role of South Carolina.
Hope you've enjoyed the conversation so far. Please join us on our next episode. We'll continue our conversation with Dr. Donaldson.